Faithfully delivering value, exploring great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we're exploring the book The Flying Tigers, subtitled Chennault and His American Volunteers. It's written by American historian Daniel Ford. During 182, an aerial force fought fiercely across China and Burma's battlefields. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they waged desperate combat against Japanese air forces. They defended southwest China's skies, covered the Burma Expeditionary Force, and bled in aerial combat. This was the American Volunteer Group, led by legendary pilot Chennault. Their planes featured shark mouths and tigers symbolizing ferocity, inspiring Disney to create a winged tiger emblem. As the group's insignia, people affectionately called them the Flying Tigers. In 6 months of combat, they destroyed 115 enemy aircraft while costing Japan 400 pilots. The Flying Tigers lost just 86 planes and 22 personnel, a 1-to-18 casualty ratio. This stood as the Allies' best air combat record against Japan before the Pacific tide turned. Their contributions proved vital to China's resistance and the global anti-fascist struggle when Chinese air power was decimated and aid scarce. After disbanding, their legacy endured. Over time, mystery enveloped their true story. To uncover the truth, Ford interviewed surviving members in the late 1980s and researched archives for the Flying Tigers, Chennault and his American Volunteers. As a veteran and amateur pilot, Ford delivers concise, vivid aerial combat narratives that immerse readers. First published in 1991 and revised in 2007, it remains the definitive Flying Tigers history. I'll explore the book in 3 parts. First, answering the call in crisis. Chennault forming the Flying Tigers. Second, aerial battles. Kunming, Rangoon, and the Burma Expedition. Third, cementing legacy. The Flying Tigers' fate. Note: World War II Japanese and U.S. Air Forces weren't independent branches but divided into Army-Navy air services. But for convenience, I'll refer to them as the Japanese Air Force or American Air Force. All right, now to Part 1. Answering the call in crisis. Chennault forms the Flying Tigers. 1937. On July 7th, Japanese invaders provoked the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Chinese soldiers and civilians rose in resistance, and the war erupted fully. Fierce battles took place not only on land, but also in the air. But, on the eve of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Chinese Air Force had over 560 aircraft. But due to budget, maintenance, and training constraints, only 188 were combat ready. In contrast, the Japanese Air Force had over 2,600 aircraft, with up to 850 deployable to the China front immediately after the war began. And so, comparing the two, the Chinese Air Force was at a 1 to 4.5 disadvantage in available aircraft. Moreover, China's aviation industry was weak at the time. Aircraft were purchased from abroad, while Japan could independently develop them. So, in a war of attrition, the Chinese Air Force was no match. Despite being in an extremely unfavorable position, the Chinese Air Force still managed to strike painful blows against the Japanese Air Force through sheer willpower and superb tactical skill. According to statistics, in the first 3 months of the war, the Chinese Air Force inflicted losses of 230 aircraft and 320 pilots on the Japanese, creating a miracle of the weak defeating the strong. However, the gap in strength was too vast. With immense war attrition, by early 1938, the Chinese Air Force had fewer and fewer operational aircraft, essentially losing air superiority. At a critical moment, the Soviet Volunteer Air Group came to fight in China. From early 1938 to June 1941, over 3.5 years, the Chinese and Soviet air forces fought side by side, destroying or damaging over 1,100 enemy aircraft, effectively crushing the arrogance of the Japanese Air Force. In June 1941, the Soviet-German War broke out. The Soviets, preoccupied, withdrew all aid personnel, and the Chinese Air Force was plunged into crisis again. In this dire situation, the Chinese government pinned its hopes on one man, Claire Chennault. Chennault was born in 1893 in Texas, USA. He joined the military at 25 and became an excellent fighter pilot. In 1929, Chennault was promoted to captain, but his path to advancement ended there. The reason was that the Western Air Force circles were filled with the doctrine of bomber supremacy, believing that with faster speed, tight formations, and mutual fire support, a bomber group could withstand any enemy fighters without fighter escort. In future air combat, fighter planes will be useless. With this doctrine prevailing, Chennault was marginalized, but he wouldn't back down. He formed an aerobatic flight team with two other fighter pilots, naming it the Flying Trapeze. They aimed to prove through teamwork that fighters could shoot down bombers, and unescorted bombers were doomed to destruction. At the end of 1935, at the National Air Races in Miami, the Flying Trapeze performed breathtaking aerobatics, drawing cheers from the crowd. Among the audience was Mao Bangchu from China, vice president of the Central Aviation Academy. After the race, Mao invited all three to come to China as instructors to train pilots. The other two agreed right away, but Chennault said he'd think it over. Over a year later, after confirming no promotion was possible, he accepted Mao's invitation. In April 1937, Chennault officially retired from the U.S. military and headed to China. As planned, Chennault would conduct a 3-month research and inspection of the Chinese Air Force and propose reforms. Soon after, the War of Resistance against Japan erupted in full scale. Chennault immediately sent a telegram to the Aeronautical Commission, the Chinese Air Force's leadership, offering to aid China's war effort. In late July 1937, Chennault was transferred to Nanjing to help plan airstrikes against Japanese forces. And on the morning of August 14th, 3 Chinese aircraft bombed the Izumo, flagship of the Japanese invasion fleet. That afternoon, over Hangzhou, the Chinese Air Force shot down 2 Type 96 Japanese bombers and damaged 1, with 0 casualties. The next day, under Chennault's command, they shot down 4 more Japanese bombers and heavily damaged 6. These 2 air battles proved Chennault's point. Fighters can shoot down bombers. Conversely, bombers without fighter escort are sitting ducks. In early September, Chennault took over air defense operations in Nanjing. Since the Japanese Air Force dominated daytime skies, Chennault switched to night raids. He even outlined Japanese warships on runways for pilots to target during training. And in actual combat, the Japanese warships' searchlights and gunfire revealed their silhouettes, causing multiple ships to be bombed and damaged. And that after the fall of Nanjing, Chennault joined air battles in Wuhan, Chongqing, and other regions. In 1938, after the Soviet Volunteer Air Group arrived, Chennault stepped back to a secondary role, focusing on training Chinese pilots and improving air defenses. But Chennault believed he could do more. Inspired by the Soviets, he conceived the idea of recruiting volunteer pilots from America. In October 1940, commissioned by the Chinese government, Chennault returned to the U.S. for recruitment, but initially faced difficulties. America was neutral in the war, and aid to China was discreet. Recruiting Americans to fight for China, even as volunteers, was too risky, as it might provoke Japan. But Chennault struggled to recruit until the Soviet Volunteer Air Group withdrew from China. That's when the situation changed. To relieve pressure on China's front, President Roosevelt signed a secret executive order in June 1941, allowing retired U.S. Air Force personnel to volunteer for combat in China, finally enabling real recruitment progress. Within a month, Chennault recruited 99 pilots and 186 ground crew, mostly active-duty Air Force pilots who retired specifically to go to China. The U.S. expedited their paperwork. The author notes these pilots knew little about China. Multiple factors motivated them to volunteer, starting with compensation. The Chinese government offered U.S. pilots $600 monthly, plus bonuses for downing enemy planes. $600 in 1941 had the purchasing power of $144,000 in 2007, still high-paying by today's standards. No, the temptation was undeniable for average U.S. pilots then. Many pilots admitted in post-war interviews they were drawn by the generous pay. Others anticipated America's eventual entry into the war, preferring to fight the Japanese now rather than face the German Air Force in Europe later. Rumors in the U.S. military claimed Japanese planes were obsolete and pilots poorly trained, making the Japanese Air Force seem easy to defeat.
Some came seeking adventure with a Wild West spirit, drawn to the excitement of China's battlefields.
Regardless of motivation, they were vital reinforcements for the desperate Chinese Air Force. On August 1, 1941, Chiang Kai-shek signed Order No. 5987, formally establishing the American Volunteer Group. From then on, the Air Force that would become world famous as the Flying Tigers officially took the stage of history. Now I'll move to part 2, Fierce Battles in the Sky. From August 1941 to July 1942, the Flying Tigers went through 3 phases: training and preparation, defending Kunming, and fierce battles in Rangoon, and covering the Chinese Expeditionary Force along the Burma Road. I'll cover them one by one, starting with the training and preparation phase. In mid-August 1941, the first Flying Tigers arrived in British colonized Burma. They originally planned to enter China from there, but later settled in Toungoo, a small town in southern Burma, for multiple reasons. First, China lacked suitable military airfields and had poor training conditions, while the RAF base at Kida Airfield in Toungoo was fully equipped. The Flying Tigers could train alongside them. Second, the fighter planes China bought from the U.S. were disassembled and shipped to Burma first. Chennault believed it made more sense to assemble them there than haul the parts over rugged mountain roads to China. Once trained, the Flying Tigers could just fly them back. So, Kiedao Airfield became their first base. Mechanics quickly assembled the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks, painting shark mouths on the noses and a winged Bengal tiger on the wings. Later, the Chinese government commissioned Disney to design an emblem. Disney added wings to the Bengal tiger, creating the Flying Tiger logo, cementing their name. Chennault personally served as instructor, launching intensive training. He first doused the overconfident American labs with cold water. Japanese pilots were disciplined and experienced, flying superior aircraft like the Zero Fighter, Type 96, and Type 99 bombers, better than current Allied planes. Underestimating them would be costly. Of course, any enemy can be countered. Drawing on experience, Chennault devised tactics. Stay agile, pair up 2 fighters against Japanese fighters, and use 3 against bombers for firepower. Gain altitude, dive fast, aim, and fire. If you miss, break away fast, climb, and dive again. Chennault stressed. Repeat this hit-and-run tactic. Never dogfight Japanese pilots. Or, he half-joked, we'll just be collecting your remains. Chennault's strict demands, combined with Burma's far inferior logistics compared to the U.S. homeland. Often, pilots barely had enough to eat, so a few started grumbling. Some also learned that the Japanese Air Force wasn't as easy to defeat as they thought, and they lost their nerve. And Chennault stuck to the principle of quality over quantity, insisting on weeding out those lacking resolve. By the eve of the Pacific War, the Flying Tigers had only 82 pilots, with just 60 combat ready. They split into 3 squadrons: Adam and Eve Squadron, Panda Squadron, and Hell's Angels Squadron. Battle was about to begin. The Flying Tigers' history entered its second phase, defending Kunming and fierce battles in Rangoon. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and simultaneously advanced into Southeast Asia, with Malaysia and the Philippines hit first, followed by Indonesia and Burma. Given the rapid Japanese advance, Chennault decided to send 2 squadrons back to China. The Kunming Hells Angels Squadron moved to Mingaladan Airport in Rangoon to cooperate with the British Royal Air Force. Rangoon was China's only port for external aid, making its defense essential. First, let's cover the Flying Tigers' performance in Kunming. Rangoon, on December 18th, the Flying Tigers arrived at Wujiaba Airport in Kunming with a total of 34 Tomahawk fighters. Before the Flying Tigers arrived, Japanese forces had bombed Kunming for 4 straight years, inflicting massive suffering on its people. The tragic scenes ignited the Flying Tigers' fury. They steeled themselves to confront the Japanese pilots. On the morning of the 20th, Chennault received a report that 10 Japanese bombers were entering Yunnan from Vietnam. Chennault decisively ordered the Flying Tigers to engage, and 24 Tomahawk fighters immediately took off, soon encountering the Japanese 21st Flying Regiment's bomber formation. Having long held absolute air superiority, the complacent Japanese didn't send fighter escorts, which thrilled the Flying Tigers. The battle lasted about half an hour. 3 Japanese bombers were shot down, and 7 were heavily damaged. A surviving Japanese pilot recalled after the war, "The gunners behind me and to my left were killed. The fuel tank was hit, but thanks to a rubber protective layer, it didn't ignite the bombs." In the end, 7 planes returned to base, each riddled with holes. My plane had over 30 bullet holes. This was the heaviest defeat the Japanese Air Force had suffered since invading China. After that, the Japanese 21st Flying Regiment never attacked Kunming again. Kunming citizens spontaneously went to Wujiaba Airport to thank the pilots. Time magazine featured the Kunming air battle with a headline, "Bloodthirsty Tigers," giving extensive coverage. The report stated the Flying Tigers achieved a miraculous victory in their first battle with 0 losses against 10 enemy planes. The Flying Tigers became world famous overnight, capturing global attention. Now to the Flying Tigers' performance in Burma. Hell's Angels Squadron was stationed at Mingaladan Airport near Rangoon, cooperating with the RAF. And last, their first battle occurred on December 23, 1941, when Japan sent 60 Mitsubishi heavy bombers to Rangoon and 15 Type 97 heavy bombers to Mingaladan. Originally, these bombers were supposed to have fighter escorts, but since Japan's unstoppable advance in the Pacific bred overconfidence, the bombers raced ahead and left their fighters far behind. After receiving the alert, Hell's Angels' 12 Tomahawks split. One team defended the airport. The other flew over Rangoon Airport. The Flying Tigers shot down 5 heavy bombers and heavily damaged 10. Over Rangoon, Japan's main force caused significant urban damage, but the Flying Tigers and RAF fought fiercely, shooting down 3 heavy bombers, including Colonel Shugaharu Sugawara, Japan's biggest loss since invading Southeast Asia. Swallowing their pride, the Japanese mobilized reinforcements. On December 25th, 63 bombers with 25 fighter escorts returned to Rangoon, led personally by Major General Yamamoto Kaji, a veteran of China's invasion. This backfired. Fighters prioritized protecting the general over escorting bombers. Whoa! Moreover, miscoordination split Japanese planes into 3 waves over Rangoon, weakening their attack. Result: the Flying Tigers and RF shot down 10 Japanese planes. Duke Hedman downed 4, becoming the Flying Tigers' first ace pilot. This air battle forced Japan to suspend bombing Rangoon, but continuous combat cost Hell's Angels Squadron 25% of their strength. Despite the Flying Tigers' efforts, overwhelming Japanese aircraft allowed bombers to kill over 5,000 Rangoon civilians. With Japanese air power focused on Southeast Asia, Kunming's air defense pressure eased. Chennault dispatched Panda Squadron for support, later replaced by Adam and Eve Squadron, so most Flying Tigers joined the Rangoon air battles. They engaged in back-and-forth dogfights with Japanese forces who gained little advantage. Take Japan's elite 14th Squadron. After a month over Hong Kong and the Philippines without losses, by mid-January 1942, just 10 days in Rangoon, their 19 Type 97 bombers dwindled to 10, nearly 50% attrition. But the Flying Tigers faced growing hardships. casualties, damaged planes, and ammunition shortages. Panda Squadron leader Newkirk reported, "Our planes look like patchwork quilts full of holes. Engines are overtaxed, ground crews overwhelmed. Frustratingly, even stellar air performance couldn't compensate for ground forces." And here, British troops were no match for the Japanese. As British forces retreated, the Flying Tigers withdrew from Mingalodon in late February 1942, main force to Kunming, Hells Angels to Magwe in central Burma. Thus concluded the 2-month Rangoon air campaign. Allies shot down 50 Japanese planes, killing 150 crewmen. The Flying Tigers achieved 1-to-2 aircraft and 1-to-12 personnel loss ratios, a rare Allied bright spot in the Pacific War's early phase. The Flying Tigers then entered their third phase, covering the Chinese Expeditionary Force, assigned to Hells Angels at Magwe. Frustratingly, poor logistics prevented timely repairs, and exhausted pilots caused non-combat losses. 11 Tomahawks crashed in 1 week from parts failure and errors, devastating morale. Worse, on March 21st, Japan launched a surprise raid with 151 bombers and fighters on Magwe. Without warning, the Flying Tigers and RAF suffered heavy losses. After that, the Flying Tigers withdrew into China. They settled in Laiyun, a small village in Ruili, Yunnan, which had both an airfield and the central aircraft manufacturing factory. Now down to just 6 Tomahawks, Hells Angels pilots flew missions into Burma, scouting enemy positions, relaying intel, and providing air cover for the Chinese Expeditionary Force. The Chinese Expeditionary Force had entered Burma in February 1942 at Britain's request. Though outnumbered, they fought fiercely. While unable to secure air dominance, the Flying Tigers dealt heavy blows to Japanese air power, greatly boosting expeditionary troops' morale. By late April, as the Expeditionary Force retreated, the Flying Tigers mission concluded. Afterward, they defended Laiyun's aircraft factory against Japanese raids from Vietnam and Thailand, who never gained the upper hand. In May, the Flying Tigers entered a rest period. Meanwhile, political negotiations over the Flying Tigers' fate unfolded between China and the U.S., bringing us to Part 3. Cementing Legacy. The Flying Tigers' fate. Their stellar performance drew intense media focus, not just Chinese outlets, but Time, the New York Times, and the Times of London, spreading their fame worldwide. So, President Roosevelt sent an envoy to convey his deep admiration and gratitude to Chennault. But Roosevelt wrestled with how to handle the Flying Tigers. Members fought as volunteers paid by China, a product of unique circumstances. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government considered absorbing them into the military. In January 1942, Chennault returned to active duty. By April, he was a brigadier general, a retired captain directly promoted to general.
This was nearly unprecedented in U.S. military history, but integrating the Flying Tigers sparked major U.S.-China disputes.
Joseph Stilwell served as chief of staff for the Allied China Theater, commanding U.S. forces there. Logically, the reformed Flying Tigers should report to Stilwell, but Chiang Kai-shek, clashing with Stilwell, opposed this. But Chennault, whose leadership style and military philosophy clashed with Stilwell's, refused to hand the Flying Tigers over to him. After repeated negotiations, the final solution granted Chennault command of U.S. fighter and light bomber units in China. Heavy bomber units would be led by officers appointed by Stilwell. Chennault wasn't satisfied, but Stilwell had backing from U.S. Army Chief of Staff Marshall, so the decision stood. Next came reorganizing the Flying Tigers. This time, controversy erupted within the U.S. military. By U.S. military standards, many Flying Tigers pilots were actually unqualified. Years of fighting at a disadvantage fostered habits like heavy drinking, rough conduct, rule breaking, and embracing risk-taking individualism. Their tactical maneuvers seemed like reckless improvisation to doctrine-following U.S. pilots.
Strict screening would eliminate most Flying Tigers members.
Chennault scoffed at this.
He told U.S. military leaders, applying so-called standards to the Flying Tigers is pure bias. These pilots repeatedly defeated Japanese air forces and developed winning combat tactics. Oh!
Their experience is invaluable for combat-green U.S. pilots. Eliminating them would be sheer stupidity. But the military accepted Chennault's argument. On July 4th, 1942, the Flying Tigers disbanded. Chennault wrote in his diary, "At midnight, the American volunteer group officially entered history. Notably, to cover the transition gap, ex-Flying Tigers kept fighting Japanese forces in Guilin, Hengyang, and elsewhere, shooting down multiple enemy planes. Among them, David Hill downed one plane, bringing his total to 10 kills, making him the second highest U.S. ace pilot at the time. I know this is type in hell. Who ranked first?"
Another Flying Tiger, Bob Neal, shot down over 16 enemy planes.
After the war, Neal confessed to the author he wasn't naturally brave. In fact, he often felt terrified and helpless as a baby, but overcame his fear, a truth shared by many Flying Tigers. Not until mid-July 1942 did these pilots gradually return to rear areas for reassignment. Ultimately, 187 out of 220 Flying Tigers members, including pilots and ground crew, returned to active U.S. military service, accounting for 85% of the total. Some were assigned to the Army, some to the Navy, others to the Marine Corps. All fought on the front lines wherever they went. One member, Gil Bright, was sent to North Africa and earned the distinction of becoming an Allied pilot who shot down 3 Axis aircraft. Jim Howard, fighting in Europe, received the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his actions. As for Chennault, he remained in China until the war's end, commanding the U.S. 14 Air Force and Sino-American Composite Wing, establishing the vital Hump airlift that delivered crucial Allied supplies to China. Interestingly, due to their fame, media still habitually called Chennault's new unit the Flying Tigers. After the war, Chennault returned to America and died of lung cancer on July 27, 1958, buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Shortly before his death, he was promoted to lieutenant general. The author notes this was the U.S. government's tribute for Chennault creating and leading the Flying Tigers. Finally, summarizing the recap from their August 1941 formation, to July 1942 disbandment. In under a year, they destroyed 115 Japanese planes, while losing 86 minus 20 of which were captured when Japanese forces overran airfields before evacuation. Counting only air combat, their 1 to 5.7 kill ratio was a decisive victory. Of 109 American pilots who saw combat, 22 were killed or captured, over 20% losses, while Japan lost about 400 personnel. Including 4 squadron commanders, their personnel loss ratio was 1 to 18, another overwhelming success. The Chinese government paid the Flying Tigers $3 million in salaries and bonuses. By disbandment, some pilots had earned substantial fortunes. Frankly, many fought for pay, but they still battled fascism at its peak. As the author states, when the British Empire waned and America panicked, they stepped into unreliable planes and fought terrified enemies to the death. May glory be to America. That wraps up our exploration of the Flying Tigers, Chennault and his American volunteers. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.